JoJo's Bizarre Adventure Over Heaven by Nisio Isin, original concept Hirohiko Araki. Dedicated to Mr. Jotaro Kujo. Foreword. If I said I didn't have any indecision about restoring and deciphering the notebook that Mr. Jotaro Kujo incinerated in Egypt, I would, without a doubt, be lying. To bring back into this world those contents that Mr. Kujo saw as too unsavory to leave in it was professionally, ethically, and perhaps fundamentally an unforgivable and barbaric act. But at the end of a series of twists and turns, the reason I came to accepting this request from the Speedwagon Foundation was, of course, not unrelated to Mr. Kujo's current amnesia and coma. The Foundation's theory that the notebook may hold a hint to the restoration of Mr. Kujo's consciousness was, at the very least, not entirely off base. When I was told that, as someone who owes a great deal to Mr. Kujo, I was not in very much of a position to preach about policy, professional ethics, or simple human common sense. In order to decipher even a part of what caused Mr. Kujo to end up in such a state, I have overcome innumerable difficulties to restore the notebook, even if it did not yield any hints to his restoration. However, if I were to say that that was the only reason I agreed to decipher the notebook, it would be a big lie. Truthfully, the first time I spoke with the Foundation, in other words, when I first learned that such a notebook had once existed, I must confess that I succumbed to sweet temptation. I felt strongly that it was something I should not do, but to at least an equal degree it was something I felt I greatly wanted. The man who once tried to make the world fall into darkness, Dio Brando. No, maybe it would be more appropriate to call him Dio Joestar, or perhaps simply Dio is best. At any rate, when learning of the existence of a notebook in which a vampire, who may have transcended humanity, recorded his goals, there is no researcher who would not be excited. With the fear of being misunderstood, I say, I was not doing scholarly work with moral conscience at the forefront of my mind. Mr. Kujo had burnt it, and even the Speedwagon Foundation treated its existence as third-class top secret. In other words, to restore and to interpret a notebook that was being treated with such secrecy, I could not help but to jump at the challenge. A vampire. Such intense charisma had he held that an army of stand users had been lured, enticed, seduced into doing whatever evil he desired. A being that was described as evil incarnate, a man that had left such large ripples even after his death. How could I turn away from knowing just what he thought, what he planned, and how he lived? I cannot lie about my motivations. Pleasant excuses such as, for the sake of Mr. Kujo, or for the sake of world peace, have lost their importance to me. To have these feelings of mine withheld would not fairly uphold my right as the first person to read the notebook. And if I am writing about fairness, then I should mention that deciphering this notebook was an intensely difficult task. So fragile are its pages. Even Mr. Josuke Higashikata could not restore the fragments of a notebook that was burned and turned mostly to ash completely into readable text. Tending to each page is difficult enough on its own, but the text itself was highly encoded and unclear. Most of the proper nouns which formed the keys of the code were translated by checking my results against the facts that the Foundation had verified. Therefore, I think I've made it considerably easier to read, but I cannot deny the notebook reads like a nonsensical patchwork. Those idiosyncrasies, themes, and the path to heaven that this emperor of evil was thinking of are unfortunately both so profound and incomprehensible that it is hard for even a specialist like me to say that he has been able to understand them himself. Most of this text is written in a sort of literal translation. I have no choice but to leave its true meaning to the wise researchers at the Speedwagon Foundation and future readers. One could say that my real work has only just begun. Of course, I will bear any responsibility for mistranslations in the document or contradictions that result from them, but I must first say that I doubt any are to be found. Anonymous Speedwagon Foundation researcher. Well, it appears that it is time for heaven, or rather, over heaven, by Nisio Isin. Who's excited? I know I am! Nisio Isin, for those of you guys who don't know, I feel kind of bad because I'd never talked about the Purple Haze Feedback author, Kadano Kohei, and whenever I did, I just called him the author. I never called him by name. But now, Nisio Isin is an author that I recognize quite well, and probably some of you guys do as well. He's written several light novels, such as the Monogatari series, which has received an animated adaptation. And I'm sure some of you guys have heard of it, if not all of you have heard of it, and some of you have no doubt seen it, and a few of you probably love it a lot because it is quite good. And similarly, he's also done Katsunagatari, which has also received an anime adaptation, and I think is fantastic. And I recommend you guys watch it as well. If you have no idea what I'm talking about, Nisio Isin's writing style is very monologue, dialogue and wordplay heavy. So these are very dense texts, and I would say that Over Heaven feels kind of similar. Now, I haven't read all of it, so I'm excited to actually engage with the text entirely for the first time here with the audiobook. But what I have read, like the first few chapters, I can say that it is very, like, it repeats phrases, it indulges in not necessarily wordplay, no puns or anything like that, but you can tell that Nisio Isin is really putting a lot of weight into each of the words that he's putting onto paper. Now the problem with that is, in translation, some of it can read kind of awkwardly, especially like these giant run-on phrases that are natural in Japanese just because that's how the language is constructed. But in English, you know, there's just so many components that you have to parse with every single sentence that it not only is it very awkward to read out loud, but it's also very awkward to understand when it's read out loud. So it's both difficult for me as an audiobook narrator, and it's difficult for you as an audiobook listener. So I will start editing parts of the text. If you've been reading along with the translation that's out there, you might have noticed that I've already started doing this from this very chapter. I've restructured and I've condensed a lot of sentences. I genuinely think that it's both easier to understand and they're just more interesting sentences overall. Now that might just be my ego talking, which we'll talk more about later. But if you don't think that is the case, then leave a comment and I'll reconsider. So, maybe we should talk about what Over Heaven is. For those of you who've played Eyes of Heaven, I haven't, so I'm just going off of the stuff I've heard and the wiki. Dio gets resurrected and then he gets a power up so that his stand turns from the world into the world over heaven, which leads to jokes in the community like the world over heaven Requiem Act 4. But as far as I understand, that has no relation to the text that we're going to be reading at all. In Over Heaven, we're going to be reading Dio's diary. How exciting is that? Dio's diary that was revealed in part 6. In fact, we learned during this foreword that the events of part 6 are concurrent to the translation, the decoding, and the writing of Dio's diary in the Speedwagon Foundation, which is pretty cool. Jotaro is off in his coma and punching people with Star Platinum if they touch his hat. Cool stuff. That's all on the back of Dio being shown as more thoughtful and restrained in part 3 and later much more thoroughly, significantly in part 6, where he's talking about, you know, what it means to go to heaven and being tied to fate and do you believe in gravity? Now, speculatively, this change in character from part 1, where he had like feathers in his coat and was super extra all the time, to part 3, where I guess he's topless most of the time, so he hasn't really reduced his fabulousness, but he has become more restrained. He's asking questions like, what does it mean to have fear, to Enya? And we see very clear evidence of Dio being much more reserved. Essentially what Over Heaven does is bridge together in a single train of thoughts, a narrative of thought, the Dio of part 3, who is more reserved and is more thoughtful, but doesn't really externalize a lot of that, to the Dio of part 6 that we see being very good friends with Pucci, talking about heaven, talking about gravity, and all the stuff that we were told is so profound and incomprehensible that did Dio even know what he was talking about? Is brought into question in the foreword, as you heard. And of course, since it is Dio's diary, we'll also be seeing stuff like him talking about Vanilla Ice and him talking about Whole Horse and the other stand users that go and fight Jotaro. He'll eventually even say, oh yeah, you know, Jotaro's made his way to Egypt. I guess I should start summoning some more dangerous stand users. So that's all very, very exciting, and that will be revealed over the course of the text. And I hope you guys are excited as I am, because I am genuinely, oh, you know, this is prime JoJo I was going to say fan content, but it's not, is it? If you've seen my Fanalysis video, then you'll know why I'm talking about Over Heaven as a fan work, because essentially most fan works are basically like this. But that's for a Fanalysis video. Let's actually get to talking about the text itself. We've read the foreword of Over Heaven, and the foreword is not actually by Nisio Isin or Dio. It's by a Speedwagon Foundation researcher who translated and decoded Dio's diary from the original manuscript, which this is actually pretty cool. Josuke restored from ash. How interesting is that? Josuke actually did get to collaborate with the Foundation for however small a purpose. He restored some ashes into a book, and apparently the restoration wasn't that good anyway, and the pages were kind of difficult to work with, but that's still kind of interesting. Again, one of the reasons why this reads a little bit like a fan work, but I won't go ham talking about it. So essentially in this video I was talking in the voice of a Speedwagon Foundation researcher, and that's what I intend to do over the course of an audiobook. This is essentially an audiobook recorded, imagine for a second, recorded for the Speedwagon Foundation archives. You know, like here's a bunch of translation notes. Here is the translation itself of Dio's diary, and someone is just recording those elements into the Foundation's audio archives. How cool is that? So essentially I'll be a Speedwagon Foundation researcher, and I'll just be reading these texts out loud. Hell, you know, I might as well just be the translator, because that'd be kind of interesting. Which gets me to this researcher's personality, and when I was talking about having an ego, I mean, come on, this guy is actually kind of a dick. The final line where he's like, you know, you can say there's some translation errors, but I doubt it. How cocky does he sound there? And especially like earlier on when he's like, you know, Jotaro really helped me, but screw Jotaro, I'm in this because a vampire wrote a diary. How cool is that? And you really get to see both his selfishness and also his fascination as a researcher trumping his own moral standing. This is how a lot of horror books start, especially in like early to mid 1900s. Essentially there's a scientist that's just like, hey, you know what? I'm so interested in the science that I'm doing that I forget about morality or like the safety of humankind. Frankenstein, Great God Pan, and I'm sure plenty of others that I'm forgetting or just never read. So that subtext is really interesting because of course JoJo's Bizarre Adventure can be read as a horror text. Sometimes it is attributed to the horror genre. So it's nice to see horror elements actually being tied back into JoJo's Bizarre Adventure from a different perspective. Although as far as I understand it's really only for this foreword, because I don't think we ever hear from this Speedwagon Foundation researcher ever again, unfortunately. But of course, as I talked about previously, I'm kind of headcanoning that he's recording himself for the Foundation's archives. This does mean that despite it being Dio's diary, I won't be doing Dio's voice, but honestly, could I do that justice? Takehito Koyasu in the anime is freaking amazing, and Patrick Seitz in the dub does hold his ground, so do I really want to stand among those giants and everyone else who's ever played Dio and done a fantastic job? No, I don't. And besides, George Dostar has Dio as far as I understand, so you'll see me doing my Dio voice there if ever. But not here, ladies and gentlemen. Here I'll be doing my own voice, pretending to be a Speedwagon Foundation researcher. There's also a couple of interesting things that the foreword brought up, like Dio's diary was coded? Why? Who exactly is he hiding things from? Surely not Enya or Vanilla Ice or anything like that. I don't see why he'd fear them reading the diary in any way. And in fact, they're so loyal that if Dio had just said, hey, don't read this diary, I'm sure no one would have read it, just because they're terrified of Dio. Also, what kind of code did he use? The researcher does say there were some keywords that we used to decode the text, but what does that exactly mean? What does that entail? None of that is unfortunately expounded upon, but whatever, it's just a small detail that I thought was amusing but kind of odd. Maybe we should talk about the audiobook itself and what I'm expecting to do for each of the chapters. Firstly, end of chapter analyses. I am planning on doing these for Over Heaven. They're probably not going to be as in-depth as what I did for Purple Haze Feedback, specifically like the final chapters of Purple Haze Feedback, where I could go like 10 minutes for each chapter. This is probably going to be like small notes that I thought were interesting about each of the chapters. Also, I'm not planning on doing any music, so if you like that about Purple Haze Feedback, then I guess that's not happening. I apologize. Or if you didn't like that about the Purple Haze Feedback audiobook, then rejoice, because it's just gonna be my voice. And finally, the chapters. There's about 80 chapters in the text, and I'm hoping to release them in about 8 episodes. So I'm hoping for about like 10 chapters per episode, which shouldn't be a lot of work. They are pretty small chapters, and more than that, it will actually be really easy then for me to just compress them all together without the end of chapter analyses and throw them all up as a single video once I'm done at the end, which I'm also still planning on doing for Purple Haze feedback. It's just that the only good quality audio that I have is for like the last third. That really pisses me off, because then I have to either re-record from scratch the entire first 2/3, which is a lot of work. And I actually started doing it, but then I just got burnt out so quickly that I stopped producing videos at all for like 3 months, hence like the big gap in uploads. But the second option is to just upload the audio that I have right now, and it's gonna like slowly scale from very low quality to like actually good listenable audio from like the last third of the audiobook. So if you're happy with that, then I can do that, but I'd be kind of upset about it. So I don't know, leave a comment about the Purple Haze feedback bulk release, how you would prefer it, if you would like it at all. Well, I shouldn't say that because I'm sure some people are still waiting for that. Yeah, so those are my plans for the audiobook. That's what I think about the foreword and the text and Nisio Isin. And I don't really have much else to say other than I hope you guys enjoy Over Heaven. I know I am planning to put as much effort into this as possible, and I'm planning to have a lot of fun with it. And I'll see you with the next episode. Until then, take care.